People only discover what they truly believe about you when the title beside your name disappears. I did not understand the meaning of those words until the afternoon I carried a small cardboard box out of the hospital where I had worked for 42 years. Inside that box were a framed photograph of my late husband, a coffee mug with faded sunflowers, a handful of handwritten thank you cards from former patients, and the stethoscope I had purchased with my very first paycheck. None of those things were valuable in the usual sense, but together they represented an entire lifetime. My name is Margaret Sullivan, and for 42 years I was a registered nurse. I had worked overnight shifts, holidays, blizzards, and weekends. I had held frightened hands, celebrated miraculous recoveries, comforted grieving families, and missed more birthdays than I could count because someone else's emergency always came first. Not once did I regret the choice. Nursing had never simply been my profession. It had become part of who I was. On my final day, the hospital gathered many of my coworkers in the employee lounge. There were balloons, homemade cookies, flowers, and far more tears than I expected. Susan Harper, who had worked beside me for almost 3 decades, hugged me so tightly I thought we might both start crying all over again. My supervisor thanked me for mentoring younger nurses and reminded everyone that compassion could never be measured on a time card. Someone handed me a scrapbook filled with photographs stretching back nearly 30 years. I laughed at the old hairstyles, recognized faces that had long since retired, and quietly wiped away tears when I reached the final page. Before I walked out the front entrance, I turned around one last time. The automatic doors closed behind me with a soft hiss, and I realized that chapter of my life had officially ended. Strangely, I did not feel empty. I felt grateful. Thomas had always told me that retirement was not the end of usefulness. It was simply the beginning of choosing how to spend your time instead of letting the clock decide for you. He had dreamed about traveling together after we both retired, but cancer stole those plans 7 years earlier. Even so, I promised myself that I would honor both of our dreams by embracing whatever came next with hope instead of fear. That evening, David and Laura invited me to dinner to celebrate my retirement. Chloe had even baked a chocolate cake that leaned slightly to one side, but tasted absolutely wonderful. The dining room was filled with laughter as everyone asked about my farewell party. I shared funny stories about old coworkers, embarrassing memories from my first week as a nurse, and the kindness shown by patients I would never forget. For a little while, everything felt exactly as I had imagined. Then Laura smiled and said, "Well, now Mom finally gets to relax." David chuckled, leaned back in his chair, and casually replied, "Yeah, after 42 years she has finally become useless." He laughed as though he had made the most ordinary joke in the world. No one else laughed. Chloe looked down at her plate. Laura's smile disappeared almost instantly. I simply sat there holding my coffee cup, unsure whether I had heard him correctly. The room became so quiet that I could hear the old grandfather clock in the hallway marking each passing second. David quickly added that he had only been kidding, but something about those words settled deep inside me. After 4 decades of caring for thousands of strangers, I drove home that night wondering whether the person who knew me best had somehow forgotten who I had always been. The next morning I woke up before sunrise, just as I had done for most of my adult life. My body still expected 12-hour shifts, medication rounds, and the quiet rhythm of hospital hallways before the rest of the city had finished breakfast. For a few moments I lay in bed listening to the peaceful silence that filled the house. It should have felt comforting after 42 years of alarms and overnight calls, yet my thoughts kept returning to David's words from the night before. I tried convincing myself he had only made an awkward joke, but jokes often reveal the thoughts people never intended to say aloud. Rather than dwell on it, I made a pot of coffee, watered the flowers on my back porch, and began writing a list of things I had always wanted to do once retirement finally arrived. Visit the botanical gardens in spring. Take a watercolor class. Volunteer at the community health clinic. Read the stack of novels that had gathered dust on my bookshelf for years. It was the first time in decades that every hour of my day truly belonged to me, and that realization brought a quiet smile to my face. Around 10 o'clock, my telephone rang. It was Laura asking whether I could pick Chloe up from school because she had an unexpected meeting. I happily agreed. 2 hours later, before I had even returned home, David called to ask whether I could wait with a repair technician who was coming to their house that afternoon. I adjusted my plans without hesitation because helping family had always come naturally to me. By early evening, I realized I had accomplished almost nothing from the list I had written that morning. The following day followed a similar pattern. Laura asked whether I could grocery shop because she was busy. David wondered if I could stay home to sign for a package. Chloe needed a ride to soccer practice because both of her parents were working late. None of the requests sounded unreasonable by themselves. In fact, each one seemed perfectly ordinary. What slowly unsettled me was something far more subtle. No one asked whether I already had plans. No one wondered if retirement might include goals of my own. Every conversation began with the same quiet assumption that my schedule had become permanently available simply because I was no longer receiving a paycheck. A week later, Susan Harper invited me to lunch at our favorite cafe near the hospital. As we sat by the window watching nurses hurry across the parking lot between shifts, she laughed and asked how retirement was treating me. I smiled before admitting that I felt busier than ever, although somehow less seen. Susan tilted her head with concern. "Busy doing what you want?" she asked, "or busy doing what everyone else wants?" Her question caught me completely off guard because I already knew the answer. I told her about the constant favors, the changing expectations, and David's careless remark during dinner. Susan stirred her tea slowly before looking directly at me. "Margaret," she said gently, "you spent 42 years answering call bells. Be careful not to spend retirement answering a different kind of bell without realizing it." I carried those words home with me that afternoon. Standing in my quiet kitchen, I unfolded the list I had written on my first morning of retirement. Not a single item had been crossed off. Instead, every day had quietly filled with someone else's priorities. For the first time, I began to wonder whether my retirement had truly marked the end of my career, or whether everyone around me had simply decided that my life now existed to fit conveniently into theirs. Over the following 2 weeks, a quiet pattern settled into my life, and once I noticed it, I could no longer pretend it was invisible. Every morning, I opened my calendar hoping to schedule something for myself, and every afternoon, I found those empty spaces filled with someone else's plans. On Monday, I drove Chloe to her piano lesson because David had an unexpected conference call. Tuesday disappeared while I waited 3 hours for a plumber to repair a leak at their house. Wednesday morning, Laura asked whether I could grocery shop because she was preparing for an important presentation at work. Thursday, I spent nearly the entire afternoon helping Chloe finish a school project because both of her parents were working late. None of these requests were unreasonable on their own. I loved my family, and I genuinely enjoyed spending time with my granddaughter. What slowly changed was not the work itself. It was the expectation behind it. No one asked whether I had already committed to something else. They simply assumed I was available because retirement had somehow become another word for unlimited free time. One afternoon, I finally took my watercolor supplies out of the closet, determined to spend a few peaceful hours learning something I had postponed for decades. I had barely arranged my brushes beside the dining room window when my telephone rang. David cheerfully explained that Chloe had forgotten her lunchbox at home and wondered whether I could drive it across town. Before her lunch period ended, I glanced at the untouched paints spread across my table before quietly agreeing. As I locked my front door a few minutes later, I realized I had answered yes before even considering whether I wanted to. That evening, I returned home and found the watercolor paper exactly where I had left it, still perfectly white, still waiting for a first brushstroke that never came. I sat in silence looking at the empty page and wondered how many years of my life had been spent putting my own plans aside without ever noticing the habit. A few days later, Susan invited me to visit the community health clinic where she volunteered twice each week after retiring. The small building served families who often struggled to access routine medical care, and retired nurses occasionally offered health education, blood pressure screenings, and wellness consultations. As we walked through the bright hallways, several young nurses recognized my name from stories Susan had shared over the years. One of them smiled warmly and asked whether I would ever consider volunteering there. Before I could answer, I felt something I had not experienced since leaving the hospital. I felt needed, not because I was available, but because I still had knowledge worth sharing. Driving home that afternoon, I caught myself smiling for the first time in weeks. My retirement suddenly looked very different from the version everyone else seemed to imagine. It was not an ending. It was an opportunity to choose where my experience could still make a difference. That evening, David called again and casually asked whether I could begin watching Chloe every weekday after school since, as he put it, you are not really tied down anymore. His voice carried no malice. He sounded completely certain that the request made perfect sense. I looked at the volunteer brochure resting on my kitchen counter, then at the calendar where I had already penciled in orientation sessions at the clinic. For the first time since retiring, I did not answer immediately. Instead, I remained quietly thoughtful, beginning to understand that if I wanted this new chapter of my life to belong to me, I would eventually have to teach the people I loved that retirement had changed my job, but it had never erased my purpose. The following Monday, I walked through the doors of the community health clinic carrying the same quiet sense of purpose I had felt on my very first day as a young nurse more than 4 decades earlier. The building was smaller than the hospital where I had spent most of my career, but the atmosphere felt wonderfully familiar. Parents waited patiently with children, older couples filled out medical forms together, and volunteers greeted everyone with warm smiles instead of hurried footsteps. Susan introduced me to the clinic director, who welcomed me with such genuine appreciation that I felt years younger. She explained that retired medical professionals helped teach diabetes prevention classes, monitored blood pressure screenings, and mentored newly licensed nurses who were just beginning their careers. Listening to her describe the program, I realized that retirement had not closed a door. It had quietly opened another one I had never expected to find. My orientation lasted most of the morning, and before leaving I had already volunteered for 2 afternoons each week. Driving home, I felt lighter than I had in months. I was no longer wondering what I would do with my experience. I had found a place where it still mattered. When I arrived home, I discovered 3 missed calls from David. I returned the call immediately, assuming something urgent had happened. Instead, he sounded almost surprised that I had not answered earlier. He explained that Laura needed to stay late at work and asked whether I could pick Chloe up from school, take her to soccer practice, help with homework, and keep her until after dinner. I apologized and explained that I had spent the morning at volunteer orientation and had already committed to regular clinic hours beginning the following week. There was a long pause before David laughed softly. "Mom," he said, "you are retired now. Surely that volunteer stuff can wait if family needs you." His words were not angry. They were simply certain. I looked down at the folder the clinic director had given me, filled with schedules, educational materials, and volunteer information. For the first time since leaving the hospital, I heard myself answer differently. "I would love to help when I can," I said calmly. "But I have commitments now too." Another silence followed. "I just thought you would have more flexibility," David replied. "After all, you are not working anymore." We ended the conversation politely, but something inside me remained unsettled long after I hung up the telephone. Later that evening, I carefully wrote my volunteer shifts into the calendar hanging beside my refrigerator. Tuesday afternoons, Thursday mornings, monthly mentoring sessions with newly graduated nurses. Looking at those handwritten appointments filled me with quiet excitement because every entry represented a choice I had made for myself. The next afternoon, Susan and I met for coffee after orientation. She smiled the moment she saw my expression. "You look like someone who finally remembered who she is," she joked gently. I laughed before telling her about my conversation with David. She listened patiently before stirring her coffee. "Margaret," she said softly, "many people confuse retirement with availability. They forget that purpose does not disappear simply because a paycheck does." I carried those words home with me and repeated them several times while tending the roses Thomas had planted years ago. Watching new buds appear on branches that had looked lifeless only weeks earlier reminded me that every season has its own purpose. Standing there in the fading afternoon sunlight, I realized I no longer feared retirement itself. What I feared was allowing other people to define it for me. And deep inside, I sensed that before long, I would have to help my own family understand the difference. Over the next several weeks, the community health clinic gradually became part of my new routine, and for the first time since retiring, I found myself looking forward to Mondays instead of dreading them. Every volunteer shift reminded me why I had chosen nursing all those years ago. I helped young parents understand childhood vaccinations, showed older patients how to manage blood pressure medications safely, and spent hours mentoring newly licensed nurses who reminded me of myself when I had first walked into a hospital wearing a crisp white uniform and far more determination than confidence. They listened carefully when I spoke, asked thoughtful questions, and thanked me for sharing lessons that could never be found in a textbook. Each afternoon, I drove home feeling fulfilled rather than exhausted. My purpose had changed, but it had not disappeared. Meanwhile, life with David and Laura continued to follow a familiar pattern. Their requests never completely stopped. Instead, they simply became expectations wrapped in polite language. David often called with sentences that began, "Since you are already home," or "You probably are not doing anything important this afternoon." I noticed that neither he nor Laura ever asked about my volunteer work, the people I had met, or the classes I was helping teach. It was as though my retirement had quietly erased 42 years of experience from their minds, leaving behind only an empty schedule they believed belonged to everyone except me. One Thursday afternoon, I received a telephone call from the clinic director asking whether I would be willing to mentor a group of graduate nursing students during a special weekend workshop. The opportunity excited me because it combined everything I loved most about nursing and teaching. I accepted immediately and marked the dates carefully on my calendar. Less than an hour later, David called to explain that he and Laura had been invited to attend a business conference that same weekend. Without asking whether I had plans, he cheerfully announced that he had already told Chloe she would be spending both days at my house. I quietly opened my calendar and looked at the volunteer workshop written in blue ink across the entire weekend. Taking a slow breath, I answered gently, "I cannot watch Chloe that weekend because I have already made another commitment." The silence on the other end of the line lasted much longer than I expected. Finally, David laughed softly as though he believed I was teasing him. "Come on, Mom," he replied. "You can always volunteer another time. Family comes first." I closed my eyes for a brief moment before answering. "Family is very important to me," I said calmly. "That is exactly why I have always tried to keep my promises. I already promised the clinic I would be there." David sounded disappointed, but even more surprised. He asked whether volunteering was really more important than spending time with my granddaughter. His question stung because it misunderstood everything I was trying to protect. This had never been about choosing strangers over family. It was about keeping the commitments I made and recognizing that my time still carried value, even after retirement. After we ended the call, I sat quietly at the kitchen table looking at my calendar. Every appointment written there represented a decision I had made for my own life instead of simply reacting to someone else's plans. For the first time in many years, I realized that setting healthy boundaries did not make me selfish. It made me honest. Deep inside, however, I also sensed that my simple refusal had changed something between David and me. He had accepted my endless availability for so long that hearing the word "no" felt completely unfamiliar. And somehow I knew that conversation was only the beginning of a much larger one our family had been avoiding ever since the day I walked out of the hospital for the very last time. The following Tuesday evening, David called and asked whether I could come over after dinner because he wanted to discuss something important. His voice sounded polite but unusually formal, and I immediately sensed that our recent conversation had not ended as quietly as either of us had hoped. When I arrived, Laura greeted me warmly. Chloe gave me a quick hug before disappearing upstairs to finish homework, and for a few minutes everything felt perfectly ordinary. Then David suggested we all sit down at the dining room table. The moment I saw several notepads, calendars, and schedules already spread across the polished oak surface, I realized this was not going to be an ordinary family visit. David smiled and explained that he and Laura had been talking about the future. Since I was now retired, they believed it would make sense for all of us to coordinate our schedules more efficiently. Laura nodded in agreement and slid a printed calendar across the table toward me. Different days had already been highlighted in bright colors. Mondays were marked for after-school pickup. Tuesdays included soccer practice. Wednesdays listed piano lessons. Thursdays were reserved for homework supervision, while several weekends had been blocked off for overnight stays whenever David and Laura needed to travel for work. I studied the calendar quietly, noticing that every available space in my week had already been assigned before anyone had asked whether I agreed. David leaned forward with an encouraging smile. "We thought this would actually give everyone more stability," he explained. "Now that you are retired, it seems like the perfect arrangement." His words were calm, logical, and completely sincere. That sincerity somehow made the moment even more painful because I realized he truly believed he was offering me something meaningful instead of taking something away. I looked down at my own calendar inside my handbag. It contained volunteer shifts at the clinic, mentoring sessions for young nurses, watercolor classes beginning the following month, lunches with Susan, and several weekends I had already promised to help organize community health fairs. Every page reflected the life I was slowly building after retirement. I gently placed my calendar beside the one David had prepared. For several seconds, no one spoke. Finally, I smiled softly and said, "I appreciate how much thought you both put into this, but my schedule is no longer empty." David looked confused. "Mom, those are volunteer activities," he replied. "They are flexible. Family should come first." I met his eyes calmly before answering. Family has always come first in my life. That is why I worked holidays, missed birthdays, and came home exhausted after caring for other people's loved ones. But retirement did not erase my right to make commitments of my own. Laura remained silent, watching both of us carefully. David sighed and leaned back in his chair. "I just do not understand why you suddenly need to stay so busy." His question lingered in the quiet room. I thought about the thousands of patients I had comforted, the young nurses I was now mentoring, the people waiting each week at the community clinic, and the dreams I had postponed for decades while building a career and raising a family. Then I answered as gently as I could. Because I spent 42 years living by schedules created for everyone else. Retirement is the first season of my life where I finally have the chance to create one of my own. No one interrupted. David looked down at the printed calendar he had carefully prepared, and for the first time, I sensed uncertainty replacing confidence. Deep inside, I knew this conversation had not ended the disagreement. It had only uncovered something much deeper than scheduling. My son still believed retirement had ended my usefulness, while I was only beginning to discover just how much life I still had left to live. For several days after that meeting, neither David nor I mentioned the calendars again. We spoke politely whenever we talked on the telephone, but there was a careful distance in our conversations that had never existed before. I continued volunteering at the clinic, mentoring young nurses, and slowly discovering that every week brought a new opportunity to help someone in a different way. One Thursday afternoon, a nursing student stayed behind after our mentoring session to thank me for explaining how compassion could calm a frightened patient even before medicine began to work. As I listened to her speak, I realized that everything I had learned over 42 years still carried value. Experience does not disappear simply because a retirement date arrives on a calendar. It continues living through the people you encourage, teach, and inspire. Driving home that evening, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. For the first time since leaving the hospital, I no longer needed my family to convince me that my life still mattered. I already knew it did. That weekend, David invited me to dinner again. The atmosphere felt pleasant at first. Chloe eagerly told everyone about a science project she had entered into a school competition, and Laura served one of my favorite chicken casseroles. Conversation flowed easily until David casually mentioned that one of his co-workers had commented on how fortunate he was to have a retired mother with so much free time. He smiled before saying, "I told him Mom has finally learned how to slow down, even if she keeps trying to stay busy." His words were not intentionally cruel, but they carried the same assumption I had been quietly struggling against for weeks. I placed my fork gently on my plate and looked at him with the same calm expression I had used countless times while comforting anxious patients. "David," I said softly, "may I ask you something?" He nodded immediately. "Of course." I folded my hands together before speaking again. If my work mattered on the Friday before I retired, why does my life seem to matter less on the Monday after? The entire dining room became silent. David looked at me without answering. I continued quietly, not with anger, but with honesty. I told him about the thousands of patients I had cared for, the overnight shifts that caused me to miss Christmas mornings, school plays, birthdays, anniversaries, and family vacations. I reminded him that I had never complained because I believed serving others was worthwhile. I explained that retirement had not erased those years. It had simply given me the freedom to decide where my experience would continue making a difference. "You once told me that I became useless," I said gently. "I know you probably meant it as a joke, but every request that assumed my time belonged to everyone else made those words feel more real." Laura slowly lowered her eyes. Chloe stopped eating and looked back and forth between us with quiet concern. David remained completely still. After several long moments, he finally spoke. I never thought about it that way, he admitted quietly. I kept seeing what you were no longer doing instead of everything you still had to offer. I smiled sadly because that single sentence explained everything. This had never been about babysitting schedules or volunteer hours. It had been about perspective. Somewhere along the way, my retirement had become a subtraction in his mind instead of a transformation. As we sat together in the quiet dining room, I realized that understanding rarely arrives through arguments. Sometimes it begins with one honest question that invites someone to see another person's life through entirely different eyes. The conversation at dinner stayed with all of us long after the plates had been cleared away. No one tried to change the subject, and for the first time in weeks I sensed that David was no longer listening simply to reply. He was listening to understand. The following Monday he called, not to ask for a favor, but to ask whether I had enjoyed mentoring the nursing students over the weekend. The question caught me by surprise because it was the first time since my retirement that he had shown genuine curiosity about the life I was building instead of the availability he assumed I had. I smiled as I told him about a young graduate nurse who had been terrified of making mistakes and how we had spent nearly an hour discussing confidence, patience, and the importance of treating every patient as a person before seeing them as a diagnosis. David listened quietly before saying that he had never realized how much teaching had become part of my career. Later that week, the community clinic hosted its annual neighborhood wellness fair, and the director invited families of volunteers to attend. Susan encouraged me to invite David, Laura, and Chloe, explaining that sometimes people understand another person's purpose much more clearly when they see it instead of hearing about it. To my surprise, they all accepted the invitation. The clinic parking lot was filled with tents offering blood pressure screenings, nutrition workshops, children's health activities, and information booths staffed by volunteers from across the county. Throughout the afternoon, I helped organize screenings, answered questions from older adults managing chronic conditions, and introduced several nursing students to community members who needed encouragement more than treatment. I noticed David quietly observing from a distance. Every few minutes, someone greeted me warmly, thanked me for previous advice, or introduced me to another volunteer as the nurse who always makes people feel safe. I could see the expression on David's face changing little by little as he watched complete strangers value experience that he had gradually begun taking for granted. At one point, Chloe walked beside me while I prepared educational materials for a children's health station. She smiled proudly before whispering, "Grandma, everyone here knows you." I laughed softly and answered, "No, sweetheart. They simply know the work we all do together." A few minutes later, the clinic director gathered the volunteers for a brief thank you ceremony. She spoke about retired professionals who continued serving the community long after leaving full-time careers. Then, without warning, she invited me to stand beside her while she presented a certificate recognizing my years of service and my willingness to mentor the next generation of nurses. The applause lasted only a few moments, but when I looked toward my family, I saw something far more meaningful than applause. David's eyes were filled not with pity or obligation, but with quiet respect. On the drive home, none of us spoke very much. Finally, David broke the silence. "I think I finally understand something," he said softly. "You did not stop making a difference when you retired. You just started making a difference in a different place." I looked out the passenger window as the evening sun painted the trees with golden light. His words did not erase the hurt I had carried since that first dinner after retirement, but they began healing it. More importantly, they reminded both of us that purpose is never created by a job title. It lives inside the character, compassion, and experience a person carries wherever life leads next. As we pulled into my driveway, I realized the conversation that had begun with one careless sentence was slowly becoming a lesson our entire family would remember for years to come. Life settled into a new rhythm after that afternoon at the community health fair. And what surprised me most was not how much my own days had changed, but how quietly my family's perspective began changing as well. David no longer assumed that every free hour on my calendar belonged to someone else. Instead, he started asking a simple question before making plans. "Mom, are you available?" Those 4 words meant more to me than he probably realized because they acknowledged something that had been missing ever since I retired. They acknowledged that my time still belonged to me. Laura also changed in small but meaningful ways. When she called, she asked about my volunteer classes before asking whether I might be able to help with Chloe. If I already had plans, she simply smiled and said they would work something else out. There was no disappointment in her voice anymore, because she had begun seeing my commitments as real instead of optional. Chloe became my favorite reminder that children often understand important lessons more quickly than adults. One afternoon, she visited while I was organizing materials for another mentoring session at the clinic. She picked up one of my old nursing badges, studied the photograph for a moment, and smiled. "Grandma," she said, "I think you still help people every day. You just wear different clothes now." I laughed softly because she had captured in one sentence what had taken the rest of us months to understand. A few weeks later, David stopped by unexpectedly carrying 2 cups of coffee from my favorite cafe. We sat together on the back porch beneath the maple tree Thomas had planted when David was still a little boy. After several quiet minutes, my son looked toward the garden instead of directly at me. "Mom," he said gently, "I owe you an apology." His voice carried none of the defensiveness I had heard weeks earlier. "When you retired, I only saw what had ended. I never stopped to think about everything that was beginning. When I called you useless, even as a joke, I reduced 42 years of service to one careless sentence. I am deeply sorry." I reached over and gently squeezed his hand. "Thank you," I replied quietly. "That apology means more because you understand why it mattered." We sat together in comfortable silence before I smiled and added one last thought. "Retirement is not the end of usefulness, David. It is simply the moment when purpose becomes a choice instead of a schedule." He nodded slowly, and I could see that he would remember those words long after the conversation ended. Looking back now, I realize I never truly retired from the things that mattered most. I retired from alarm clocks, hospital corridors, and overnight shifts. I did not retire from compassion. I did not retire from experience. I did not retire from teaching, serving, encouraging, or loving the people around me. Those gifts were never printed on an employee identification badge, and they certainly did not disappear the day I cleaned out my locker at the hospital. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I still walk through the doors of the community health clinic with the same quiet purpose that first led me into nursing more than 40 years ago. Every time I mentor another young nurse, I see a small piece of my younger self reflected back at me. Every time I come home to my garden, my family, and the peaceful life Thomas always hoped we would someday enjoy, I understand something that retirement finally taught me. A career may have a final day, but a meaningful life never does. The title beside your name may eventually disappear, yet kindness, wisdom, and purpose remain long after the job is finished. Those are the things no retirement can ever take away, and they have become the greatest legacy I could ever leave for the people I love. Thank you for listening and for being part of our community. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel for more inspiring and thought-provoking stories.